you're looking for a recipe for black bean brownies, there's a lot out there. It's hard to know which recipe is the best one that you're really going to enjoy and that just doesn't taste like a pan of black bean puree. If you're a mom, you also have to make sure they pass the kid test. I'm making black bean brownies for my daughter who's craving a good brownie, and it's got to pass the kid test. Today, I'm taking two of the most popular black bean brownie recipes on the internet and on YouTube, and I'm giving them a test run. We're going to go head to head on these two recipes and see which one is the winning recipe. I'll be trying chocolate-covered Katie's recipe for black bean brownies, as well as Danny Spee's from Clean and Delicious. I also happen to have a black bean brownie recipe on my channel, and it was one of my very first videos where I was a little awkward. For fun, I'll link it below. As a chef, I always love looking for new recipes and trying popular recipes that are out there. So let's get started and see which brownie is going to be the winner. I'm starting out by making chocolate-covered Katie's recipe for black bean brownies. I'm preheating my toaster oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm adding 1.5 cups of cooked black beans, 2 tablespoons of carob powder. I'm using this in place of the cocoa powder that the recipe calls for. 1/2 cup of quick oats, 1/4 teaspoon of sea salt, 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/3 cup of maple syrup, 1/4 cup of avocado oil or coconut oil. The recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. I'm using vanilla powder instead. It's more concentrated, so I'm only going to use 1 teaspoon. I'm using a pinch of monk fruit extract, or you could use stevia like the recipe calls for. Now blend everything together until you have a nice, smooth, even batter. I'm adding 1/2 cup of carob chips, or you could add chocolate chips like chocolate-covered Katie calls for. Now place the batter in a lightly greased 8x8 brownie pan. Smooth the top and sprinkle with extra chocolate chips, or in my case, carob chips instead of regular chocolate chips. And I'm going to lightly press the carob chips into the top of the brownies and bake them in our 350 degree Fahrenheit oven for 17 minutes. Wow, these smell and look delicious. I'm going to let them cool for 10 minutes like chocolate-covered Katie recommends before slicing. And then you can cut them into 9 or 12 brownies. These brownies have a really nice texture. They're a little on the soft side, so you definitely have to let them cool before cutting them. And you can even refrigerate them to help firm them up. She recommends that in the recipe. But I love how they have a little bit of a crackle on the top, just like a regular brownie. These brownies were definitely a winner in my book. I didn't get to record myself tasting them, but they were amazing. My daughter enjoyed them as well, so they passed the kid test. And I like how there was an option to add stevia, keeping the sugar content down. Time for brownie number 2 from Clean and Delicious Danny Spee's Black Bean Brownies. I've gathered all of my ingredients here. I'm taking a shortcut by using some canned black beans. These are good quality beans. You can make your beans from scratch if you like. I'm using the Missy J's carob powder instead of cocoa powder. And these are also carob chips instead of regular chocolate chips. The recipe calls for oat flour. I'm using some oat flour that I made myself. It's super easy to make your own oat flour. You basically just take any rolled oat and grind them up in a high-powered blender. And then you have your own homemade, freshly made oat flour. Plus, I like to use the sprouted oats, and I've never found flour made from those type of oats, so that's where I also like to make my own homemade. I'm measuring out 3/4 cup of flour. Most of the time I like to make my beans from scratch, and when I do, I really like this brand, the Rancho Gordo beans. If you can find them at your grocery store, they're just really fresh and creamy tasting once they're cooked up. This is a big can of black beans, and I did not need all of them. I only needed 15 ounces. So the rest I can save to use in another recipe. Okay, so now I'm just gonna mix together the dry ingredients. I've got my 3/4 cup of oat flour. The recipe calls for a 1/2 teaspoon of kosher salt. I'm using Himalayan coarse salt. I'm using 1/2 cup of carob powder, and you can use 1/2 cup of cocoa powder like the recipe calls for. You probably know this already, but with baking, you don't want to take your measuring cup and just shove it down into a bag of flour or cocoa powder. You want to spoon the dry ingredients into the cup and then ideally level them off. This is a brownie, so it's not so precise, but if I were baking a cake, which is a little bit more delicate, I probably would go to the extent of leveling off with the back of a butter knife. Reality moment, I just realized I was supposed to sift that carob powder. Has that ever happened to you? Now her recipe calls for vanilla extract. I'm using vanilla powder because I prefer to use the alcohol-free vanilla powder. It really has an intense vanilla flavor, so I won't need as much. And since this is a dry ingredient, instead of adding it to the wet ingredients like vanilla extract, I'm gonna add it to the bowl of dry ingredients. The recipe calls for a tablespoon of vanilla extract. I'm using 2 teaspoons of vanilla powder instead because it's more concentrated, you don't need as much. And it's more expensive, so you don't want to use a whole lot. But it will give it an amazing, intense, delicious vanilla flavor. Last but not least, for my dry ingredients, I'm going to need 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Now just whisk it all together. I feel like I'm breathing in a cloud of carob powder. I'm going to preheat my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And I love using my toaster oven for baking. It just perfectly fits a pan of brownies and I don't have to heat up the whole big oven. For the wet ingredients, the recipe calls for combining them together in a blender. So I'm putting my black beans in there. And again, that was 15 ounces of black beans. Here I've got 3/4 cup of maple syrup. The recipe calls for 3/4 cup of water. I don't know why, but I feel nervous about this ingredient, but I'm going with it. I hope it doesn't make the brownies too moist, but I'm trusting this recipe. Now we're just gonna blend this together into a nice smooth puree. Pour the wet into the dry. Okay, so I can see now that we definitely did need that water added there because this is a thick brownie batter, but it really looks like a nice consistency. Now the recipe calls for adding 1/3 cup of chopped walnuts. I didn't realize that I was out of the English walnuts. All I have is the black walnuts. They have a kind of distinct bitter flavor. They're considered a superfood. If I was making these just for me, I would totally add these. But since they're for my daughter, I'm not gonna add these. She's not crazy about the taste of black walnuts. So we'll just add the 1/2 cup of chocolate chips, or in this case, a carob chips. I'm going to lightly oil my 8x8 baking pan with a little bit of avocado oil. I like to use these rather than the sprays because they contain propellants. I have to say I like the way this is filling up the pan. This is a nice height for brownies. Some of these recipes have batter that's a little bit on the skimpy side. Now we're going to bake this at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. Wow, that really is a pan full of brownies. While I'm waiting for the brownies to cool, I'm going to go ahead and make the icing, and the icing is just 3 simple ingredients. I love that this recipe calls for a frosting. I feel like bean brownies do tend to be a little bit on the drier side, or just texturally have a little bit of a hard time matching up to a typical brownie. So the addition of a nice, delicious frosting really adds a perfect touch. So we've got 1/2 cup of our carob powder, but the recipe of course calls for cocoa powder. I'm using carob. This is 1/3 cup of maple syrup. And 2 tablespoons of softened coconut oil. You can melt it if you like. The recipe does call for melting it, but mine is pretty soft, so I'm just going to stir this in. I really should have melted the coconut oil because I have some little hard bits of the coconut oil in there. What I'm going to do is just add a little splash of some hot water to smooth that out. Thankfully, with just the addition of a little bit of hot water, I pulled this out of the fire and got the perfect frosting consistency. So now let's go ahead and cut these into 16 little squares. I can tell just from cutting into these, I really like the texture here. It's just a nice, thick, dense brownie consistency. All right, time to give this a taste test. It's really hard to get a perfect first piece, and maybe I'm rushing it a little. These are still a little warm. Time for the taste test. Let's see who the winner is. This is looking like a really good brownie. I love the height. It's just got like nice volume to it. Looks like it has really nice texture. This looks like a really good brownie. Wow. I really like the texture of that. It's just the right amount of sweetness. Love the texture, love the frosting. I love everything about this brownie. Out of the 2 recipes, this is my preferred black bean brownie, and my daughter liked it better as well. In all fairness, perhaps I could put this same type of frosting on the other recipe and see how that would be. I think that would really add a nice touch to the other brownie and make it a little bit more decadent. The black bean brownie recipe from Chocolate Covered Katie is delicious as well. It's good for people who are used to more healthy types of desserts. But if you're looking for more of a family-friendly recipe that will not seem so obviously a black bean brownie, I think this recipe is going to be more convincing and probably more kid-friendly as well. I definitely recommend Chocolate Covered Katie's black bean brownie recipe. It's a great low sugar option and it really was delicious. Everyone's taste buds are different, so you should really try both recipes and see which one you like best. Let me know in the comments. It was a tough choice between these 2 delicious recipes, and I will link to the original videos below in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.